Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools, the travel company led by reporters around the world. It's a year out before the US midterms, but both Democrats and Republicans are gearing up for them. In true form, Donald Trump has promised a Republican landslide, while the Democrats are optimistic they can seize one or both houses of Congress. But will the Democrats, stinging from their 2024 loss, and faced with record low unpopularity, be able to find their voice? We're joined by Malcolm Brown, our veteran US expert. Hello and welcome, Malcolm. You in Virginia, as normal?
I am at home in Virginia, surrounded by dogs at the moment, so apologies if any cacophony breaks out.
I suppose the big thing is that the Democrats are in disarray, but it's very difficult to do anything when Trump is running this massive media machine in the White House. I mean, there's just no way of getting away from it.
Yeah, I mean, news cycles have got so truncated that something that was wildly current and massively gripping an hour ago is suddenly dated and seemingly irrelevant and largely forgotten, now. So it's really hard for the Dems to break through this trifecta where they don't control either the Congress or the White House, any of the branches of government. Obviously, they wouldn't control the courts per se, but that's very difficult for them. And I think critics would say that their leadership has been really lacking. In fact, at the end of our last tour, somebody asked the very perceptive question, who will be, because Donald Trump had just been re-elected for the second time, who will be the Democratic leaders? And at the time I said, well, these will be likely, initially at least, these will be the leaders in Congress. And you would think, where Donald Trump is so controversial and certainly his support for him, his polling numbers are not very good, this would be happy days for the Democrats. But the only thing that looks worse than Donald Trump are congressional Democrats. I mean, if you look at the leadership approval ratings for the leadership in Democratic leadership in the House, I'm just going to look at the numbers because I made a note. This was per a recent CNN report. Approval rating of 27%, and even Republican leaders who are far from popular are at 37%. So both of them are unpopular, but the Democrats notably less popular even than the Republicans in a very unpopular Congress.
Yeah. I'm absolutely fascinated by the idea that it's very difficult to trip up Trump with anything, and even within his own party. And if you were to take Iran as an example, much talk beforehand is that the party split on this. This is very controversial. You're going to get people like Marjorie Taylor Greene coming out. You clearly did. You have Tucker Carlson giving Ted Cruz a hammering during an hour-long interview in which you're basically saying the US is doing another country's foreign policy. And then you get Steve Bannon saying, the Iran wasn't even a direct threat to us. And you can go into that. But now that seems to have quietened down again. It just seems as though even he can seem to rise above that.
Yes, parenthetically, that Ted Cruz interview is definitely worth watching if you haven't seen it. It's what the kids would nowadays call massively cringe. It was really remarkable television theatre. But I think part of it, I think many commentators would say, is that our expectations of truth telling and so on have been degraded. So things that would have caused a huge fuss, several presidencies ago, now sort of slide by the wayside, partly through exhaustion, I think, on the public side, and partly through just diminished expectations of truthfulness and straightforwardness from our political leaders. So the capacity for outrage, I think people are just certainly Democrats seem overtired by outrage. You can't stay at, Spinal Tap level 11 for your entire life. So at some point you have to calm down. So the question is what you do when you calm down. But it's certainly true. And also the pace of events. You could be thoroughly outraged by something that Trump said last week, and now there's the prospect of a conflagration, a fresh conflagration, extended conflagration, potentially in the Middle East. And now you're talking about whether the Straits of Hormuz are going to be closed and where the Iranians might take their revenge. The prospects, increased concern about domestic terrorism as a result, all this stuff. So just I think people are punch drunk somewhat by that, and a discourse that is carried out largely on social media isn't really designed to have the kind of thoughtful, involved, long-term debate that maybe is required by some of the bigger issues that the country faces.
We'll come to the midterms themselves in just a bit, thinking about strategy candidates, where the actual battles will be. So we'll do that in a second. But I do want to come closer to home, where I think there are some real policy issues that Democrats could see as a strength or a challenge. One is immigration, and then it's obviously a very big one. And then I think going after the universities, Harvard, maybe the Republican base, that's sort of good stuff for them, but a sense of outrage among others. And then what's happening with the judiciary as well. But let's deal with that first one: immigration, sending in the National Guard to California. It really has put Democrats on the back foot.
Yes, I mean, the optics were exactly as Donald Trump wanted them to be, even though Democrats protested that we were really just talking about a square mile or so of central LA, massive city. People living in LA and other parts were largely unaware of any of this happening. This was not the kind of Rodney King style massive conflagration. But nonetheless, the images of heavily armored police officers facing off against masked protesters, some of whom carried the Mexican flag, was not a great image. The flag waving in particular went down very poorly across the board. It played into the narrative in the US that there's this foreign invasion underway, where you see masked Mexican flag carrying protesters throwing back tear gas at police. It all looks anarchic and out of control. You see Waymo, those are the driverless taxi cars being burnt in the streets. It all looked out of control and fed the narrative that's come from the conservative right, that the cities are a sort of anarchic hellscape from which few survive. So it really helped Donald Trump. And calling up the National Guard, federalizing the National Guard, so basically the White House taking control of California's National Guard. Normally, the National Guard is commanded by the governor of a specific state, but it is within the president's powers to federalize them. And certain circumstances, more court challenges took place. At the moment, Donald Trump's decision to federalize the Guard has been upheld in California, so they can still to act. And bear in mind, he also activated active service US Marines, who are not designed for that purpose at all. But again, the president does have the right in certain circumstances of insurrection to call up active service military. But it's hard to make the case that that was the situation. But nonetheless, there's a slight rally around the flag when you see US Marines getting involved. And so, the Dems don't have a great answer to that, other than to say, look, this wasn't as big as it seemed, which isn't a very strong argument. It doesn't sound very strong, even if it's largely true.
So far, Trump clearly wins from that, and the Democrats can't cope with it. But I am intrigued by one thing, and this has come up in repeated presidential elections that we've covered. I remember seeing this in Ohio with the Ohio farmers, and we saw it again in Iowa. During was it Iowa? No, Michigan. In Michigan, and Iowa too. But I've seen this now and Michigan. But lastly, when we were in Michigan, we had to go to a Trump rally, and we didn't manage to go and see the farmers that we were planning to. But those farmers that we were planning to speak to said they needed their Mexican workers. They liked their Mexicans. They're Mexicans. And that I'm just wondering, as more and more as ICE continues to arrest people, as ICE goes on, there has been a bit of a kickback on this.
Yes, I mean, on two fronts on that you've got these ICE agents, both in rural areas and in the cities, going around without insignia on their uniform. It might just say police on their flak vest, but they're heavily armed in some cases, helmeted. They were fully masked, sometimes with sunglasses on, so really very hard to identify, and just grabbing people off the streets. That is not a good optic, and that cuts across. Libertarians are similarly concerned about that kind of behavior as Democrats might be. And the clear difficulty that the Trump administration faces, particularly as it relates to farm workers that you've raised, was highlighted by the fact that Donald Trump has sort of a commentator put it, flip, flop, flipped, where he initially said, mass deportation. Stephen Miller, his advisor, was really leaning hard on ICE and Homeland Security generally to increase deportations to, I think, 3,000 a day. So they were really, the cuffs were off, the leash was off, and they had started by saying we're going to get rid of the worst and focus on criminals. And really it became, maybe they went after criminals, but also people who were caught up incidentally during the apprehension of a criminal, they could also be hoovered up. And then sort of really just, they were looking around, they were turning up to work sites, farm sites.
Yeah.
Farm workers weren't turning up to work. They were hiding in the fields on occasion. You've got people driving around, honking their horns, alerting potential people here potentially illegally that ICE was on its way or present in a neighborhood. But Donald Trump, getting back to my point, initially, he's very strong. We're going to have mass deportations. Then gets a lot of negative feedback from farm country, and also the hospitality business, his business, part of it, and says, oh, well, we're going to ease off on that. Then there's a bit of a mini revolt among his more hardline supporters on that topic, and we go back to, we're going to do deportations. But that shows that he's sensitive to it, and he shows that it's difficult in farm country. And I was just illustrate how important this is to farmers. I was just reading, and I think it was the Wall Street Journal within the last couple of days. They had a long and detailed account of a farmer out west who had he'd lost some of his American labor, shall we say, and he had gone to extraordinary lengths through a grant from the federal government to bring someone over from Guatemala. Reams of paperwork that he and his wife had poured over at night, hundreds of pages to get one worker over from Guatemala, and it really hinged on these funds that he was getting from the federal government. He'd even gone as far as to buy the guy a pickup truck so that he had a semi-wide, a small pre-made housing for him when he came over. He'd identified the guy, he'd interviewed him, the whole thing, and then the funding got swept up in all these federal cuts. So it's very much unclear. And he's made some financial commitments based on that funding. So you can see ways in which he was.
I think this is really fascinating because this was it's a leitmotif. This is a point that has got populists around the globe. I mean, in the West, in Europe and the States, huge amounts of votes, but it's becoming more complicated in the States, and it's just interesting to see how it tracks.
We should say that there are plenty of examples, though, anecdotally, of farmers and others just saying, this is really tough right now, but this is what we have to do in order to get this, to Donald Trump's vision of a better America. So some of them are prepared to suck it up, to use the American term.
Okay. But I mean, my last point was, the last 2 points were really to talk about I think we could talk about the courts and the judiciary for a long time, but going after Harvard University, freedom of speech, going after the law firms, which I think we've spoken a bit about before as well. It would strike me that, again, for the Democrats, this would be a key thing. But if you're going after elite students and going after foreign students, it's maybe that's not the sort of rallying cry that people are interested in.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that some of the second-tier effects of these decisions won't be felt for a while. So. And I would extend the higher education thing to medical research, for instance, which is sort of related, obviously. The National Institutes of Health have had deep cuts. But if you kill a cancer program now or stop funding it, the impacts of that are not felt for a while, and something that just doesn't happen. It's sometimes harder to see than something that you had and was taken away. So it may be that some of the impacts of these decisions will take a while to permeate politically, even though they're having real world impacts right now. But yeah, Donald Trump has looked around the political landscape and gone, who's very unpopular, and higher education. I mean, it's very easy to portray Harvard University as an out of touch elite university sitting on tens of billions of dollars in its endowment and seeming like an elite institution that has little bearing on the lives of ordinary Americans. And so, yeah, you go after them. People are not standing around in the streets with placards saying,
Save Harvard.
Save Harvard, right.
Yeah, okay. Well, listen, let's turn to the actual votes themselves. And please do, anyone watching, do start putting questions in the Q&A box or raise your hand, and then you can put your questions directly to Malcolm. Just off the top of your head, where do you think are the sort of key battlegrounds? What are them? What races are you most interested in?
Well, perennially, the 5 swing states, but within them, somewhere like Pennsylvania is interesting. We go there a lot on the tours, and it's always quite revealing about the thinking. For instance, interesting now, I don't think he's re-up, but Senator John Fetterman, we've covered a lot. A giant of a man who is singular in his sartorial choices in the Senate, where he's often seen wandering around in a hoodie, sweatshirt. But he's now sort of flirting with, not so much with MAGA, but certainly with MAGA positions. Very pro-Israel, for instance, in the current environment. So it's interesting to see that. But you do have, and you look really at the states. In this case, we're looking a lot also at states, not necessarily in the swing states, but states where a Democratic governor, for instance, has done well in not a sort of heavily Democratic state. So Governor Beshear in Kentucky is interesting because he's managed great political success, seems to be reasonably popular across the aisle. So that's the kind of, we're sort of looking at not just at what the results are doing, but who are the personalities in this environment where there's a kind of a void of Democratic leadership. The heavy hitters are just not really there. Bill Clinton's, he still has great name recognition, but he's, I think, probably fairly seen as a man of the past. Barack Obama doesn't seem too interested in really getting involved on a daily basis. In fact, the commentator George Will said that he occasionally, I think the phrasing was, he comes down from the Mount of Olympus to a pine occasionally, but that's largely it. So it's very hard. So we're looking around, I think, in these races coming up, is to see, yes, what are the general trends?
But that's a reflection of the weakness of things, isn't it? Because you can't talk about issues that they've created for themselves that are strong, where they can win points against the White House. So you're looking around, you're clutching at straws, hoping for some standout speaker, standout politician to sort of pull people together. And I suppose it's a different political system to what we're used to.
And I think you can make the case that they have some issues they can work with. I mean, the economy being a key one, we'll probably talk more about it. But, there is stuff on the economy that they can make the case on. This big, beautiful bill that's currently still in Congress contains some really dramatic stuff that it would normally be great fodder. I think many would say that the Democrats just don't have the personalities to make that case effectively. So I think the other thing we'll see is, as soon as these midterms have taken place, I mean, it's already somewhat underway, but as soon as the midterms are out of the way in November, you're going to see real positioning for who will be the voice of the Democratic, or the key voices of the Democratic Party, and thereby potential candidates going forward.
Yeah, okay. Alex Norris, who's, where are you at the moment, Alex? You need to open your microphone.
I am in New York City, where it is a heat wave descending on us right now.
It's very cold here in Llanbobol, where Alex was until very recently. So it's nice and cool and breezy here. But Alex, I know we've all got questions, but go ahead, fire away with some of yours.
Yeah, I don't want to jump the gun here with this question, but I wanted to ask, essentially, there's been a lot of talk among some circles in the Democratic Party of finding or trying to elevate a candidate for the 2028 who is potentially sort of a non-politician. There's talk of sports commentators, of actors, people who essentially are in the entertainment business, like Trump was before he took office, and can sort of speak his language and match his energy. I want to hear your thoughts about how the party is positioning for that, and whether or not you think that that's going to be
You've both got, Alex, you were talking about sport. Tell us who the sports commentator was, Alex.
There's a popular basketball NBA commentator named Stephen A. Smith that if the reports are to be trusted, or is being sort of questioned and prepped for a potential run in 2028.
For the presidency you're talking about?
Yes, but I mean, I would imagine that this would pick up steam during the midterms and then, sort of go into the 2028.
Yeah, yeah. And
I mean,
Ghana.
that's a mark of the sort of, I mean, I'm not to disparage him. He's an excellent commentator. But, that's a mark of the kind of desperation, I think, on the Democratic side, or on the urgency, I suppose, would be a more charitable way of putting it, of finding this figure. The other person that we could allude to, just George Clooney, sometimes talked about. He has been involved in Democratic politics, and he was famously one of those to raise the alarm publicly about Joe Biden's declining mental condition and cognitive health. So he is seen as a, potentially serious person. Whether he would play in Minnetonka, I don't know. But
he would be an absolute disaster in the Midwest, and if you're thinking about more traditional areas, East Coast, West Coast, cliche, really.
Right. I think that's probably fair. But he's a smart guy. I mean, a smart guy cares about politics. So, he is put in the frame. There are more likely candidates, but, in an environment where things are so extraordinary, I think people maybe reach outside the box. Yeah. And in the environment where, as you said, Donald Trump is president, given his prior political experience, there is a view that maybe you should look outside the usual toolbox for someone different.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to go in the reverse direction, and Alex can come back to you and go to the more sort of traditional way of looking at battlegrounds, and come back to Pennsylvania. We were talking about Fetterman. The other person is the governor, Shapiro. Alex, can you talk about both their qualities? I mean, there was some people were saying, listen, Fetterman's the ideal candidate. He is just more truly working class, and he knows how to speak to ordinary people. He's just so unusual. He's going to really grab people's attention. I mean, obviously there has health concerns. He's had a major stroke. And Alex, how did you take that? And then on Shapiro, fantastic, amazing speaker, but he's loathed by the left. He's pro-Israel as well. I suppose that's just part and parcel of the Democratic Party. Your thoughts on both of those, Alex?
Yeah, certainly. Fetterman is, as Malcolm has sort of alluded to, is definitely an odd character, an unusual senator, to say the least. And he represents a sort of some would say the populist left as well. He's, working party, working class. He himself comes from a rural part of Pennsylvania. So he speaks to, I think, areas that the Democrats have made losses in the past 8 years or so, where they struggled to compete with Trump. And he, in many ways, is being seen, I think, by some party insiders, as what I've heard, as a potential candidate himself in 2028, or at least somebody who can, down the line be influential. Meanwhile, I think Shapiro is a little bit more establishment. I think Malcolm can probably add his own thoughts on this. But Shapiro is a Democratic governor who won big in a state that's obviously contentious, that's looking like it's more, it's going to be a long-term battleground state. So I think that he is being looked at by some people as well for the future, but in many ways, they represent sort of polar opposites of the Democratic Party, and I think where they would bring it if they were sort of prominent in the future. But I think in general, Fetterman is someone who I think a lot of people are looking at as an answer to Trump, potentially on the left.
But we have to bear in mind, a lot of this will depend on sort of how the competition within the Democratic Party between the progressive left and the centrists pans out, and who will be more influential in choosing their candidates. And the same thing has applied in the past to Republicans. So, someone who will appeal to the radical base of your party, which is the most involved, has the most energy, may not be the person who is best positioned in a general. So, yes, Shapiro would be regarded in this scenario as the moderate centrist-ish, and Fetterman would be more apart from his views on Israel,
yeah,
would be the more progressive sort of radical candidate. But the Israel thing is something of a touchstone for the base of the Democratic Party, and it would be hard to see if the base were to be the deciding factor, and it typically is. It would be hard to see how progressives would ever hold their nose to support someone like Shapiro or Fetterman, just on the basis of their views on
Israel. Yeah, that's the real, and I find that absolutely fascinating, considering what's happening. And we thought that the Israel-Palestine issue could be a really decisive factor in in Michigan, and perhaps it was in that you had many people who voted out of or abstained, voted for the third candidate because they were so cross with the Biden White House, and the good people of Hamtramck, who are all Yemeni and conservative socially, all voted for Biden, and Trump has just banned all their countrymen from entering the United States. So they might not be so happy with the vote afterwards. But yeah, the other, I was interested in Pennsylvania because it's how do you assess that race? How does that bolster the party? It also says something about those individuals there. You mentioned Andy Beshear of Kentucky. He's standing up for, I think he's set to be in the Democratic Governors Association next year, which will give him a bit more prominence. Who else is out of office that could be around that we should also keep an eye on?
Well, the only out of office that sort of jumps to mind is Pete Buttigieg, who's perennially talked about as he's certainly of the moderate Democratic camp, openly gay, in a marriage, has children, but has served in the US military, and was until in the Biden administration was transport secretary. He's seen as an excellent communicator, and his moderation is seen as potentially appealing to a wider electorate, but question whether he could also get the nomination. He's never done well among minorities. So that would be a challenge to get through a Democratic primary in that way, even if it were a benefit in or less relevant in the general election. So he's the one that jumps to mind. A lot of the bench really of people that you think about at this stage does tend to be either in Congress or more likely at this point governors, because they have the executive experience. They actually have to work across the aisle. They have to get stuff done rather than just standing around shouting at each other. So that's a place where one tends to look. And there are some others you could think about. You've got Wes Moore, who's African-American governor of Maryland, popular, not hard to get elected as a Democrat in Maryland, although he did take over from Larry Hogan, who was and is a Republican. So you've got characters like that out there, but they're all in office. So Tim Walz, obviously, having run with Kamala Harris, he's an obvious potential candidate. J.B. Pritzker, who's the governor of Illinois. One other who's not in office, I should mention, Rahm Emanuel, veteran. He's the sort of many Democrats are sort of, they want their own knife fighter, basically.
Chicago.
Tough. Plain speaking, again, very pro-Israel. So, could be challenging, but he's the guy in a political knife fight that will definitely hold his own. He's smart. He was in the Biden administration, was the US ambassador to Tokyo, and is now clearly back in town and making it known that he's interested.
That's really fascinating. I'd completely forgotten about him, and I think that's of all the people we've been speaking about, I think that's probably one of the strongest sort of voices that one can think of. We've got some questions coming in. We've got Richard Murphy, who can't ask this himself for technical reasons, but he says, can you talk about how actual election results across the country are going? Are the Democrats doing well enough on the ground at the moment in elections to, for example, replace dead, resigned Congress people? I mean, what's happening at the local level and how are they doing?
We are, well, actually, so speaking as a Virginian, we will have a special election, but it hasn't occurred yet. It's coming up following the death of a veteran local Democrat. I think his seat, I'm not sure how instructive it would be. He's very likely to go to a Democrat. So you're really looking, we just had primaries last week on Tuesday, where, again, looking locally, in fact, the governorship, which is widely watched here in Virginia because governors cannot serve more than one consecutive term. The primary is interesting because we know that the current governor will not be able to stay, and the Dems candidate, Abigail Spanberger, is a real moderate. She's a national security moderate. She came out of the CIA, I believe, certainly out of the national security apparatus. I think it was the CIA. So she is, inoculated from some of the standard attacks about ineffective, weak national security Democrats that come from the other side. So we don't have a lot of results that would be very probative about where we are at the moment.
Yeah, okay. In a bit, I'm going to talk through what we're going to be actually doing on our next midterms tour, which we're actually using New York for and then DC. So I'll come back to that in a second. But we've got a question from John. John R, I know his surname. Go ahead, John.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Cool. Yeah, go on.
Hi, Malcolm. I enjoyed our trip at the last election. Nice to see you again. Donald Trump seems to outwit the media, the Democrats, the leaders of democratic countries. He's always ahead of the game, whether it is organising new tariffs or new policies or new attacks on institutions or even flip-flopping in policy. Is he just too clever for us all, even as he antagonises huge swathes of the globe and of the US?
I'm not sure I would attribute it to an excess of skill and intelligence. I mean, let's take tariffs. So, he announces tariffs. Many, including in his own party, think that's utterly self-defeating. There is an intellectual incoherence at the center of it, which is, on one hand, he wants tariffs as a long-term fundraising measure in order to lower taxes for Americans. But on the other hand, he wants to use it as leverage, i.e. would be prepared to surrender tariffs in return for concessions from foreign governments. So there's all this intellectual incoherence to this stuff. His brilliance, I guess, is that doesn't seem to affect him politically. So, I'm not sure how to attribute that other than going back a little bit to my punch-drunk comments of earlier. And in terms of other countries, I mean, there's not much they can do about it. I mean, it may be counterproductive for US purposes, but it also has very real world negative impacts around the world. So you sort of have to suck up to Donald Trump. And people are getting better at doing this. Your success or failure in the world at the moment slightly depends on how far you're prepared to abase yourself and the skill with which you do it. Because that gets you concessions, and that is a skill. It's a sort of negotiating skill, I guess. So,
I think, Malcolm, you've got to
trade with the US, really, in many cases.
I think you've got to give them credit for being able to go after key institutions, using the federal government's power to pursue things in a way that is so divisive and so destructive that it's truly shocking, and it grabs everyone's attention. And we've talked about going after universities. We talk about sending in the National Guard, deporting people. They are doing this. I mean, we looked at the Project 2025, which had many of these policies in, but the vigor with which they're going after it really is quite, astounding. It is really sort of shock and awe stuff. So I think you have to give the administration credit for the speed and the aggression with which they've gone after these things. So
That's true. And
there is strategy there. There's strategy there.
Well, they have correctly observed that the courts cannot move as fast as the executive. So if you flood the zone, as you've just pointed out, with dramatic policy change in every sphere of American life, largely, the courts just can't keep up with that. Court cases can take years traditionally to get to the Supreme Court. So in the meantime, assuming, and that's why they're going after the ability of a local federal court, a district federal court to issue a nationwide injunction, because that's one of the few barriers still where if you have a judge in one of the federal districts, they can, at the moment, issue an injunction to stop whatever policy it is nationally. If that can be successfully undermined, then there are much fewer constraints to what the administration.
Yeah. So my supporting John's argument there is that there is there's a plan, and it has been it is being executed with vigor. And you might say with Doge and the actual cuts and savings, it hasn't been efficient, but they have been dramatic in their political effects. You've got to give them credit for that. I'd also come separate from that, and I think this is not about intelligence, but this is more about Trump's ego, and that's John Bolton's analysis of Trump, which is, why has Trump gone to war with Iran? Why has he dropped bombs on Iran? It's because he doesn't like Benjamin Netanyahu stealing his limelight. He does. He's no longer leading the headlines. Bibi's out there doing stuff in Iran. He's not on the front page. He's not the ticker on CNN or whatever. And he's outraged by it. And this is the way of getting back on top. So it's narcissism at its worst, rather than in intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally true. I mean, if you look at the narrative arc of US support for Israeli strikes on Iran, this started out with what was perceived to be a notably cool statement from Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, about the initial Israeli strikes, and expressing no great support, and certainly not saying that the US would get involved, and lots of discussion about how the US would not get involved. And then quite rapidly, we went from that position to the supposed 2-week warning to Iran, followed by the breaching of that 2-week warning within a matter of 2 or 3 days, to launch the US's own strikes. And then when asked about this, the administration has about this apparent disparity in positions and change in positions, the administration is essentially saying that Donald Trump is crafty like a fox, that this was all a ruse.
Yeah, incredible. I am very much looking forward to our tour with you. It's not for a year and a bit. But we've chosen New York. Well, the two points I wanted to make. One is that we've chosen New York because of the UN, and it's got that sort of international dimension to it. We can get access to, diplomats are going to talk about the impact of Trump's presidency across the world. And this is the main thrust I want to get at, which is, what is the legacy of Trump's administration? How will he have changed the world if he's in office, for 4 years, which we presume he is just going to be in office for 4 years? And then the question, the other one, is about what is the state of democracy in the United States after this. And I think New York's a very good place to do that as well. You've got organizations like the ACLU, you've got Human Rights Watch. So we're going to be able to get access to all of those organizations, as well as key diplomats. And then New York itself, I think, we think of New York City, and obviously it's all completely Democrat. But if you go up to the north, which we're hoping to do, it's much more conservative. And I think that's if the Democrats are going to win, if they're going to try, and they've got to get places like that back again. And those places are rural, local. That Trump has done very well in those kind of places. But so that's also because we've done Michigan, we've done Georgia, we've done Florida, we've done Ohio, and this is the upstate New York is different for us. Malcolm, any of your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the international component, he's dramatically reshaping international relations. So it would be very interesting to talk to some allied or representatives or people with a view about allied nations, and also traditional US adversaries, because he's remaking relationships with both. Notably, it'd be great to get a view on alliances, especially NATO. That's an area will be interesting to see where that goes, because certainly, having just spent a few days in the UK myself, it's clear that relationship's being remade, and the Europeans are evidently thinking about not necessarily an alternative to NATO, but how do you have a NATO in which you can't rely on the US, and how do you make some of your own security decisions? And now accepting the 5% defense investment, that was unthinkable a short while ago. I mean, Trump has been fighting to get, that's an area of great success of his, where he's been fighting to get Europeans to spend a larger share of their GDP for years, and now we're at 5%. Now that's somewhat because of the instability that he has created, in addition to the moral arguments he's.
Yeah, I don't think it's convincing intellectual arguments about.
Right.
They haven't got our back. Shit, we've got to do something.
It's panic, yes. nonetheless, it's action that he has taken. So the international entities and the human rights and a component of it will be very interesting. International aid is also another area where we'll have access. We haven't designed the program yet, but we could be talking to the World Food Program. All those UN agencies are there because the whole international aid structure has been dramatically rewritten by this administration. USAID is, a shadow of that. That's the agency that does aid for the US government is a shadow of what it was. Aid is still being delivered, but they're thinking about different ways of delivering it. But it's, at the end of the day, there's just a lot less of it as well, aside from the bureaucratic reconstruction.
Yeah. We've got a tour next year that goes to Poland and Lithuania, and we are looking at exactly that question. How does Europe rearm itself? We've just done a talk on Poland. Poland is hitting 5%, like very, very. I think it's at 4.2 or 4.3% already. It's already the amount of armaments it's bought. It has the largest number of tanks in Europe. It's bought weapon systems from the UK. South Korea is now a major exporter of weapons to Europe. And this is really, really happening now. And then beyond that, there are all the questions about Russian propaganda, disruption, the GRU working in various places, buying elections and shaping elections. All those things are, these are really key questions at the moment. I've got a question from Hillary, and I don't know if we can have her online. Hillary's actually got a question about border force and immigration, and it's a very good question, and it's slightly niche because of where you've been, Hillary. But it's good to ask Malcolm and ask about this. So go ahead, and I think many people will be interested in this. Go ahead and ask.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going back a bit to what you were talking about earlier, and I may have missed. I had to leave my computer for a few minutes, but I have heard several anecdotal, not anecdotes, real people from reliable sources about pretty rough treatment by border force people at immigration. I have an Iranian visa in my passport, as presumably Nick does, because we all went there in 2017. Should I be worried when I head to the US next week? That's one. And I just want to add that I have heard from my US friends and family that there is quite a lot of protest going on all over the country. The Kings one, what was it called? Not a King or Kings. No Kings. Yeah, that's been quite widespread. So I'm hopeful that there is opposition mounting.
Hillary, I've just got to jump in here with a slight bit of concern. Did you get a 10-year visa from after you went to Iran?
Yes, mine is 10 years, so I've got it until 2027.
Theoretically, that should. I'm going to have to renew mine because mine's, I think, from 2016 actually. So I may have to renew mine fairly soon. But legally, you should be okay. It's just a question of how they treat you at the border itself. Malcolm, have you heard anything to the contrary?
I mean, you do hear about, well, I mean, not so much I haven't heard people having trouble with an Iranian visa, and I have had an Iranian visa in my British passport. I actually am a dual national, so it wouldn't necessarily show up in the passport itself. But I mean, the broader point is, yes, you do hear horror stories about people being. There was a well-reported story recently about a young journalist I think he was from New Zealand. Anyway, foreign journalist who was coming in, and they were looking at his social media output, and a lot of it was perceived to be very pro-Palestinian, and he was sent packing. There was a German tourist who was, I don't even know why she was apprehended, but there was some problem with her paperwork, and she was held for quite a period of time. All that said, I think you should be fine if you straightforward and so on with the officers that you deal with. But it is interesting that you ask the question. It's a sensible question. And oddly enough, I was just in the UK, as I mentioned, and at a family funeral, and this came up when they discovered, and a lady asked me, she just wants to come on holiday to the US. And it's illustrative of the times that we're in. She said, do you think I should come to the US on holiday if I want to come? And I said, I think you'll be fine. But, the people are asking this question, and there is enough anecdotal evidence out there that, bad things can happen at the border, that you should certainly make sure that all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed and all that stuff. And I do think the border agencies feel emboldened, empowered may be the better word, at the moment. No one's going to be reprimanded for being strict at the border in the current environment. So that may not.
Well, they do have evidence that I go to the US every year and live there. I mean, my whole life history comes up in front of them, so I'm hoping I'll be all right. But
yeah, I think
I've heard enough stories to be just a little bit apprehensive.
Yes, and in answer to your Five Kings thing, I mean, there was a lot of criticism of the media for not covering that sufficiently. As a sort of lapsed media type, I sort of understand why that's the case. It was very diffuse. It's hard to get your arms around something that's happening all over the place. But the estimates, there were credible estimates that 5 million people were on the streets during the recent demonstrations. I mean, one of my local villages, which it really is quite small, there were a few dozen people, a couple of dozen maybe, on the side of the street. If you extrapolate from that to around the country, I mean, that 5 million number sounds plausible, and that's a good chunk of people. It's hard to get people to spend an entire day of their weekend, to rally around a single issue. And so that was notable, I think. And it may be fair to say that the media didn't give it as much attention as the military parade, which coincided with it.
So, Malcolm, as we sort of draw to a close, I do want to circle back to that question about the long-term impact of Trump's presidency. And in terms of who wins next time, there are many things. Here we are. We're barely 6 months into this presidency, and the things that he has done are colossal. And as you pointed out, with things like Harvard, the medical programs being cut, not just at university level, but also the federal level, these will take time to sort of work their way through the system before they have a political effect. And I suppose the really fundamental one is the economy, the impact of tariffs, but just the overall uncertainty of this presidency. And I wonder how that is going to affect people in a year's time or even less.
Well, I mean, given the current trajectory, we've just seen, the economic numbers are such that the Fed is not lowering interest rates currently. Growth, its estimates of growth have gone down. The full impacts of the tariffs are yet to be felt, because some of them are in this sort of 90-day hold period. But it's pretty clear that tariffs are here, on the current trajectory, tariffs are here to stay. You could argue whether it's going to be at some ludicrously high number, several 100%, or whether it will be, but a 10% tariff, which is, say, under the British deal, which is the only deal that's actually occurred so far, which is still not fully a deal, but anyway, it's the only one that has any real detail to it. That still presupposes a 10% tariff. And that's on a, historically friendly nation to the US. So tariffs here to stay. And whatever the administration says, that will drive up consumer prices. And it's hard to, the tax proposals and the spending proposals and the cuts, particularly in this big, beautiful bill, as it's called, are really dramatic. And if they took effect, it would literally remake the landscape in some cases. There are millions of acres of public lands that would be sold if this proposal went through as it's currently configured. Now, we're a long way from that, but that is part of the idea. The tax proposals have been widely criticized as being, mostly from the left, but not only, as being the largest transfer of wealth from the poor to the wealthy in US history. And if that were to take place and that were to be felt and that were to be true, it would be hard to see how some of the blue collar support that Trump attracted would feel great about any of that. It's a question of how long that takes to filter down, and it will be, whatever happens, it will be a very tricky period for whoever does take the White House in 3 and a bit years.
So much has been happening in such a short period of time. It's just so hard to take it all on. So it's how do you work out what's going to happen in 6 months, a year's time with the pace of change? It's just, I think we're all we're slack-jawed.
Yeah, and then lay on AI onto all of that.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying about the media age. The big picture stuff, the tectonic stuff that's happening, we don't always see that or pay enough attention to it, but it's happening whether we are paying attention to it or not.
Yeah. I will make one point before we wrap up, and that is we've got to talk on with Charlie Gamble on Friday with Owen Bennett-Jones interviewing him. Charlie Gamble used to run the Iran desk in the UK's Foreign Office. He is, I think, one of the UK's top foreign policy strategists. He's now writing a series of novels connected to a hippie in Afghanistan. So he's got another vocation, but he really is an outstanding speaker and analyst. So if people are around, do tune in on Friday. We've got another talk also on Thursday as well about restitution and the stuff we nicked during our colonial past with Barnaby Phillips. So just alerting everyone before we wrap up. Malcolm, it's been a fantastic talk. Thank you very much indeed again. I really enjoyed it, pretty comprehensive. And obviously we will be coming back to you again in the next year and a bit before our wonderful tour.